The CEO told me, restructuring requires difficult decisions, when he terminated my employment 3 months before my $1.1 million stock options were scheduled to vest. My name is Gregory Manning, 58 years old, Chief Technology Officer with 22 years at Data Tech Solutions. I had built the company's entire technical infrastructure from a 3-person startup to a $50 million annual revenue technology firm specializing in enterprise data management platforms. When Jonathan Pierce explained that market pressures and operational efficiency demanded immediate cost reductions, I simply said, "Thank you for the opportunity to contribute to Data Tech's growth." What Pierce didn't realize was that my systematic approach to documentation and strategic planning had created comprehensive records of every major corporate decision, including evidence that would expose his deliberate manipulation of termination timing to avoid expensive stock option payouts. The termination meeting took place in Pierce's corner office on a Wednesday morning, exactly 91 days before my stock options would mature on December 15th. The timing was suspiciously precise for what Pierce characterized as urgent restructuring driven by unexpected market conditions. "Gregory, this decision reflects current economic pressures rather than your technical contributions," Pierce explained while reviewing prepared termination documents. "Your leadership of our infrastructure development has been exceptional, but operational realities require immediate cost adjustments." I maintained professional composure while noting Pierce's visible nervousness during discussions about my pending stock option maturation and the company's recent financial performance. "Our board recognizes your technical expertise, but current market conditions make your salary level unsustainable," Pierce continued, avoiding direct eye contact while explaining the termination rationale. The explanation contradicted Data Tech's recent quarterly reports, showing record revenue growth and expanding client contracts that I had personally architected through infrastructure innovations and strategic technology implementations. "What timeline are you providing for my transition responsibilities?" I asked, while mentally cataloging the inconsistencies between Pierce's stated rationale and the company's documented financial performance. Pierce handed me a standard separation agreement that included immediate termination with 2 weeks severance pay, but notably excluded any reference to my stock option agreements or pending maturation dates. "We need immediate transition to minimize operational disruption," Pierce replied. "Your access will be terminated today, and IT will handle system administration responsibilities internally." The rushed timeline was unusual for senior executive transitions, particularly given my exclusive knowledge of critical infrastructure systems that supported Data Tech's core business operations. I gathered my personal belongings from my office while maintaining professional demeanor, though internally analyzing the suspicious coordination between my termination timing and the December stock option vesting schedule. The automated email archiving system I had implemented for corporate governance compliance had been sending copies of all internal communications to my personal backup server, creating comprehensive documentation of corporate decision-making processes. What I discovered during my first evening of analysis was sufficient evidence to contact my brother, Robert Caldwell, who specialized in securities law and corporate governance violations. "Robert, I need consultation about potential securities fraud related to my termination timing," I explained during our confidential phone call. "The documentation suggests systematic manipulation of termination schedules to avoid stock option payouts." Robert had handled executive compensation disputes throughout his 15-year career and immediately recognized the seriousness of strategic termination timing designed to avoid securities obligations. "Gregory, if Pierce terminated you specifically to avoid stock option vesting, you're looking at securities fraud and potential criminal violations of federal investor protection statutes," he explained. The evidence I was compiling showed not just individual termination timing manipulation, but systematic patterns affecting multiple senior executives over the previous 2 years. My email archives contained board communications discussing cost optimization through strategic timing of personnel decisions and specific references to avoiding expensive option payouts through termination scheduling. Pierce has been systematically terminating senior executives within 6 months of major stock option vesting dates, I documented. The pattern affects at least 6 other executives with combined option values exceeding $3.2 million. The systematic nature of Pierce's approach suggested deliberate securities fraud rather than legitimate business restructuring driven by market conditions. Robert reviewed my preliminary evidence and immediately recommended comprehensive documentation, preservation, and potential federal securities enforcement action. Gregory, the Securities Commission has specific jurisdiction over stock option manipulation and corporate fraud, Robert advised. Your systematic documentation provides comprehensive evidence for federal investigation. The email archives I maintained included Pierce's strategic communications with board members about timing terminations to maximize cost savings while avoiding securities obligations to departing executives. We need to coordinate personnel decisions with option vesting schedules to optimize operational costs, Pierce had written to board chairman Patricia Stevens. Strategic timing can eliminate significant compensation expenses. The documented evidence proved that Pierce had been deliberately manipulating termination timing to steal stock option compensation that executives had earned through years of successful performance and company value creation. Have you ever discovered that someone was systematically stealing earned compensation from multiple colleagues through deliberate timing manipulation? Corporate securities fraud often targets the most valuable employees whose success created the very options being stolen. My 22-year career at Data Tech Solutions had been founded on building scalable technology infrastructure that transformed a small startup into a major enterprise data management platform serving Fortune 500 companies. The technical systems I had architected generated the revenue growth and market valuation that made executive stock options valuable, yet Pierce was attempting to steal those options through systematic termination manipulation. I had joined DataTech in 2002 as employee number 7, when the company consisted of 3 programmers operating from a shared office space in Austin's technology corridor. My background in enterprise architecture and database optimization had positioned me to build the technical foundation that would support massive scalability and growth. Gregory's infrastructure design enabled DataTech to scale from 3 employees to 150 staff, while maintaining system reliability and performance, noted founder testimonial from our 10-year anniversary celebration. His technical leadership created the competitive advantages that attracted major enterprise clients. The stock option agreements I had negotiated reflected my essential role in company growth and value creation. The December 15th vesting date represented compensation for 22 years of 60-hour weeks, weekend system maintenance, and innovative solutions that generated millions in recurring revenue. Manning's technical innovations enabled DataTech to capture 23% market share in enterprise data management, observed industry analyst Patricia Newman. His infrastructure architecture provides competitive advantages that justify premium pricing and client retention. The $1.1 million in pending stock options reflected DataTech's market valuation growth from startup to acquisition target, value that I had personally created through systematic technical leadership and infrastructure development. But Pierce's recent behavior suggested he viewed my earned compensation as obstacles to profit maximization rather than legitimate rewards for documented performance and value creation. Gregory, your stock option structure reflects outdated compensation models, Pierce had commented during recent performance reviews. Current market conditions require more flexible approaches to executive compensation. I had interpreted these comments as general compensation philosophy, rather than threats to manipulate my earned stock options through strategic termination timing. The technical infrastructure I had built included comprehensive email archiving and corporate governance documentation systems that had been capturing Pierce's communications about cost optimization and personnel strategy. Our email compliance systems document all corporate communications for regulatory and legal protection, I had explained to the board during system implementation presentations. Comprehensive documentation ensures corporate governance compliance and strategic decision transparency. Pierce had apparently forgotten that his strategic communications about termination timing and option avoidance were being systematically documented through the very systems I had implemented to protect corporate interests. The archived communications revealed Pierce's systematic study of executive stock option schedules and strategic planning for termination timing that would maximize cost savings. December represents significant option vesting exposure across multiple senior executives, Pierce had written to board chairman Patricia Stevens. Strategic personnel decisions could optimize compensation costs while maintaining operational capabilities. The documentation showed that Pierce had been methodically analyzing every senior executive's stock option vesting schedule to identify optimal termination timing that would eliminate compensation obligations. Manning's December 15th vesting represents $1.1 million in compensation costs that could be eliminated through strategic timing, Pierce had noted in board communications. The evidence proved that my termination wasn't driven by performance issues or legitimate restructuring needs, but by Pierce's deliberate scheme to steal my earned stock option compensation. But Pierce had made critical errors that would expose his systematic fraud and create overwhelming evidence for securities enforcement action. His documented communications included specific references to avoiding expensive payouts and optimizing compensation costs through strategic timing that proved deliberate intent to manipulate securities obligations. We need to coordinate termination decisions with option schedules to maximize cost benefits, Pierce had explained to board members in emails that constituted documentary evidence of securities fraud. The systematic nature of Pierce's approach was revealed through his termination timing patterns, affecting multiple executives over 2 years. Senior Vice President Michael Rodriguez had been terminated in March, exactly 4 months before his $850,000 stock option vesting date. Chief Marketing Officer Sarah Davis had been dismissed in August, 3 months before her $720,000 option maturation. Director of Sales Thomas Wilson had been terminated in November, 2 months before his $650,000 stock option vesting. Pierce's termination timing patterns show systematic manipulation designed to steal stock option compensation from multiple executives, I documented. The combined stolen options exceed $3.2 million across 6 terminated executives. The evidence revealed not isolated termination timing manipulation, but systematic securities fraud affecting multiple victims over extended periods. Robert Caldwell reviewed my evidence compilation and immediately recognized the comprehensive nature of Pierce's securities violations and the potential for federal criminal prosecution. Gregory, Pierce's systematic stock option theft constitutes securities fraud that carries federal criminal penalties up to 20 years in prison, Robert explained. The documented evidence proves deliberate intent to defraud multiple executives of earned compensation. The Securities Commission investigation would provide federal enforcement capabilities that could result in complete option recovery plus penalties for Pierce's systematic fraud. SEC investigators have specific expertise in stock option manipulation and corporate securities fraud, Robert noted. Your documentation provides comprehensive evidence that eliminates most defense strategies. Pierce's confidence about avoiding stock option payments was about to encounter federal securities enforcement and systematic documentation that would expose every aspect of his fraud while ensuring appropriate criminal accountability. Have you ever maintained documentation systems that became crucial evidence for exposing systematic corporate fraud affecting multiple colleagues? Sometimes technical infrastructure designed for compliance becomes essential protection against executive manipulation and securities violations. The comprehensive analysis I conducted during my first week after termination revealed that Pierce's stock option manipulation was part of a broader pattern of corporate fraud designed to inflate company profitability before an anticipated acquisition that would personally benefit him, while systematically stealing earned compensation from senior executives who had created the company's value. My forensic review of email archives showed that Pierce had been coordinating with board chairman Patricia Stevens and potential acquirer representatives to eliminate compensation liabilities that would reduce acquisition attractiveness and his personal payout as CEO. Pierce's communications referenced strategic elimination of senior executive compensation to improve acquisition metrics, I documented. His systematic termination timing was designed to maximize acquisition value while stealing earned stock options. The sophistication of Pierce's scheme included coordination with the board's compensation committee to modify stock option vesting requirements retroactively, creating additional mechanisms for avoiding executive compensation obligations. Board minutes show discussions about revising option vesting criteria to eliminate payouts for terminated executives, I compiled. Pierce was systematically changing compensation rules to justify theft of earned stock options, but the most damaging evidence was Pierce's direct communications with TechCorp Industries, the potential acquirer, about eliminating legacy compensation obligations through strategic termination timing. Pierce promised TechCorp that senior executive compensation costs would be eliminated before acquisition closing, I noted. His termination timing was specifically designed to reduce acquisition costs while stealing millions in earned options. My brother Robert Caldwell reviewed the expanded evidence and immediately recognized that Pierce's activities constituted federal securities fraud involving interstate commerce and potential criminal conspiracy. Gregory, Pierce's coordination with potential acquirers about eliminating stock option obligations elevates this to federal conspiracy charges, Robert explained. The interstate commerce aspects create federal jurisdiction for prosecution. The Securities Commission complaint that Robert prepared included comprehensive documentation of Pierce's systematic option theft, board coordination, and acquirer communications that proved deliberate securities fraud affecting multiple victims. Pierce's documented activities violate federal securities laws, fiduciary duty obligations, and criminal fraud statutes, the SEC complaint stated. His systematic termination timing constitutes deliberate theft of earned executive compensation. The technical evidence I provided included email server logs, board communication archives, and financial documentation that established clear timelines of Pierce's fraud and coordination with other parties. Pierce's email communications provide documentary evidence of deliberate intent to defraud executives of earned stock option compensation, SEC investigator Jennifer Walsh noted during initial case review. But Pierce had made additional errors that would strengthen the securities fraud case and demonstrate the systematic nature of his compensation theft scheme. His communications with TechCorp included specific references to optimizing personnel costs and eliminating expensive legacy obligations that proved commercial fraud in addition to securities violations. Pierce's acquirer communications show deliberate misrepresentation of company liabilities and employee compensation obligations, I documented. His fraud extended beyond option theft to potential acquirer deception. The board communications revealed that Pierce had been systematically overriding compensation committee recommendations to avoid stock option payouts that had been legitimately earned through documented performance. Board Compensation Committee had approved all executive stock option grants based on performance metrics that were exceeded, I compiled. Pierce's termination timing violated board-approved compensation agreements. The criminal implications were significant. Pierce's systematic theft of earned compensation, combined with his coordination with potential acquirers, constituted multiple federal violations that could result in substantial prison time. Securities fraud involving systematic compensation theft carries federal penalties up to 25 years in prison, Robert explained. Pierce's coordination with acquirers creates additional conspiracy charges. The SEC investigation was expanding to include TechCorp Industries' knowledge of Pierce's termination timing and their potential participation in securities fraud through acquisition negotiations. TechCorp's communications with Pierce about eliminating executive compensation suggest potential conspiracy to defraud stockholders and executives, SEC investigator Walsh noted. Meanwhile, I was documenting the technical systems and infrastructure knowledge that Pierce had lost through his systematic termination of senior executives, creating operational vulnerabilities that would damage company performance. Pierce's termination of 6 senior executives eliminated 85 years of combined data tech experience and institutional knowledge, I calculated. His cost optimization scheme will create operational failures that reduce company value. The technical systems I had built required specialized knowledge that remaining staff didn't possess, creating critical vulnerabilities that would impact Datatech's ability to maintain client relationships and system reliability. Datatech's infrastructure depends on architectural knowledge that Pierce eliminated through his systematic termination scheme, I documented. His fraud will create operational disasters that destroy the company value he was trying to protect. The evidence I was compiling included not just securities fraud, but systematic corporate mismanagement that would damage Datatech's operational capabilities and competitive position. Pierce's compensation theft scheme eliminated the technical expertise necessary for company operations, I noted. His fraud will create performance failures that justify SEC intervention. The Securities Commission investigation was proceeding with unprecedented speed due to the comprehensive documentary evidence and the clear pattern of systematic fraud affecting multiple executives. Pierce's documented communications eliminate most defense strategies, SEC investigator Walsh reported. The evidence proves deliberate intent to commit securities fraud through systematic termination timing. Pierce's attempt to steal millions in earned stock option compensation was about to encounter federal securities enforcement capabilities and comprehensive documentation that would expose every aspect of his systematic fraud. Have you ever assembled evidence showing that corporate fraud was designed to benefit specific individuals while systematically stealing earned compensation from multiple colleagues? Sometimes comprehensive documentation becomes essential for exposing sophisticated securities manipulation disguised as legitimate business restructuring. The Securities Commission investigation that Robert Caldwell initiated on my behalf moved with remarkable efficiency due to the comprehensive documentary evidence that proved Pierce's systematic stock option theft was part of a broader securities fraud scheme involving board coordination and potential acquirer manipulation. Federal investigators recognized that Pierce's activities represented textbook securities violations that warranted maximum enforcement action and criminal referral. Mr. Manning's documentation provides the most comprehensive evidence of systematic stock option manipulation that our office has encountered, SEC lead investigator Jennifer Walsh explained during our coordination meeting. Pierce's documented communications eliminate any possibility of claiming legitimate business restructuring. The federal investigation strategy involves simultaneous examination of Pierce's board communications, potential acquirer coordination, and systematic termination timing that affected multiple senior executives over 2 years. Pierce's activities violate federal securities laws, fiduciary duty obligations, and anti-fraud statutes that carry both civil and criminal penalties, investigator Walsh noted. The systematic nature of his compensation theft justifies maximum enforcement action. The subpoena authority that SEC investigators possessed allowed comprehensive examination of Datatech's board communications, financial records, and external acquisition negotiations that Pierce had been conducting. Federal subpoenas will secure all board minutes, compensation committee records, and external communications that document Pierce's systematic fraud, Walsh explained. Meanwhile, I was providing additional technical evidence about the operational damage that Pierce's systematic termination scheme was creating for Datatech's business operations and client relationships. Pierce's elimination of senior technical staff is creating critical system vulnerabilities that threaten Datatech's core business operations, I documented. His compensation theft scheme will destroy the company value he was attempting to protect. The client relationships I had managed for over 20 years were beginning to experience service degradation and technical failures that resulted from Pierce's elimination of essential technical knowledge. Datatech's largest client, Morrison Industries, is reporting system reliability issues that coincide with Pierce's systematic termination of technical staff, I noted. His fraud is creating operational failures that validate SEC intervention. The evidence compilation was revealing that Pierce's stock option theft wasn't just securities fraud, but systematic corporate mismanagement that threatened Datatech's viability and stockholder value. Pierce's compensation theft eliminated institutional knowledge necessary for company operations, Robert observed. His fraud creates additional grounds for securities enforcement and potential criminal prosecution. The board communications that SEC investigators obtained through subpoena revealed that Pierce had been systematically misleading directors about the operational impact of his termination timing scheme. Board minutes show Pierce represented systematic executive terminations as cost optimization, rather than revealing his intent to steal stock option compensation, Investigator Walsh reported. The board had apparently been unaware that Pierce's restructuring recommendations were specifically designed to avoid stock option vesting dates rather than address legitimate operational concerns. Board Compensation Committee members were not informed that termination timing was coordinated with option vesting schedules, Walsh noted. Pierce's fraud included systematic board deception about his compensation theft scheme. But the most damaging evidence was Pierce's communications with TechCorp Industries that revealed his promises to eliminate executive compensation obligations as part of acquisition negotiations. Pierce's acquirer communications showed deliberate coordination to reduce acquisition costs through systematic theft of earned executive compensation, Walsh documented. TechCorp's initial response to SEC inquiries suggested they had been unaware of the fraudulent methods Pierce was using to eliminate compensation liabilities. TechCorp claims they were told that executive departures reflected voluntary resignations rather than strategic terminations to avoid option payments, Walsh reported. The potential acquirer's cooperation with SEC investigators was providing additional evidence of Pierce's systematic deception and securities fraud. TechCorp's acquisition due diligence records show Pierce misrepresented executive compensation obligations and termination rationale, Walsh noted. Pierce's response to the SEC investigation revealed his growing recognition that his systematic fraud had been comprehensively documented and would be impossible to defend through legitimate business justifications. Pierce has hired criminal defense attorneys rather than securities law specialists, Robert observed. His legal strategy suggests recognition that he faces criminal prosecution rather than civil enforcement. The criminal defense team that Pierce assembled included specialists in white-collar fraud and securities violations, indicating his understanding that federal prosecutors were building criminal cases based on the comprehensive evidence. Pierce's legal team specializes in federal securities fraud defense, Walsh noted. His attorney selection proves he understands the criminal implications of his systematic stock option theft. But Pierce's criminal exposure was expanding beyond simple securities violations to include conspiracy, mail fraud, and potentially racketeering charges based on his systematic coordination with board members and external parties. Pierce's systematic fraud involves multiple parties and interstate communications that create federal conspiracy liability, Federal Prosecutor Michael Torres explained. The comprehensive evidence I had provided was supporting federal charges that could result in decades of prison time plus complete restitution of stolen stock option compensation for all affected executives. Pierce's documented activities support federal charges that carry combined penalties exceeding 30 years in prison, Prosecutor Torres noted. The Securities Commission enforcement action was proceeding parallel to criminal prosecution, ensuring comprehensive accountability for Pierce's systematic theft, while providing immediate relief for victimized executives. SEC civil enforcement will provide immediate stock option recovery, while criminal prosecution ensures appropriate punishment for systematic securities fraud, Walsh explained. Pierce's confidence about avoiding stock option payments was about to encounter coordinated federal enforcement that would expose every aspect of his fraud while ensuring maximum accountability and victim compensation. Have you ever provided evidence that supported simultaneous civil and criminal enforcement actions against systematic corporate fraud? Sometimes comprehensive documentation enables federal investigators to build cases that address both immediate victim relief and long-term criminal accountability. The coordinated federal enforcement actions that began executing 8 weeks after my initial SEC complaint created immediate disruption to Pierce's acquisition negotiations while exposing the systematic nature of his stock option theft to board members, potential acquirers, and industry colleagues who had been deceived about Datatech's executive compensation practices. The civil enforcement and criminal investigation proceeded simultaneously, creating comprehensive pressure that eliminated Pierce's ability to avoid accountability. The SEC emergency enforcement action immediately froze Pierce's personal assets and required suspension of all acquisition negotiations pending resolution of securities fraud charges. Mr. Pierce's assets have been frozen to ensure availability for victim restitution, SEC Enforcement Director Patricia Stevens announced. His systematic stock option theft warrants immediate protective measures to prevent additional fraud or asset concealment. Pierce's response to the asset freeze revealed the extent to which his personal financial planning had depended on acquisition proceeds and systematic theft of executive compensation. Pierce's emergency motions show panic about his frozen assets and suspended acquisition timeline, Robert Caldwell observed. His financial strategy was built entirely on fraud proceeds and acquisition manipulation. The TechCorp Industries acquisition negotiations had been immediately suspended when SEC investigators presented evidence of Pierce's systematic deception about executive compensation obligations and operational vulnerabilities. TechCorp has withdrawn from acquisition discussions pending resolution of securities fraud investigations, TechCorp General Counsel David Kim announced. We cannot proceed with acquisitions involving systematic securities violations and operational misrepresentation. The acquisition suspension eliminated Pierce's primary motivation for the systematic stock option theft while creating additional pressure for complete accountability and victim compensation. Pierce's acquisition strategy collapse removes his incentive to continue fighting securities fraud charges, investigator Walsh noted. His cooperation becomes essential for minimizing criminal exposure. But Pierce's legal team was discovering that the comprehensive evidence made defense strategies impossible while creating exposure to additional federal charges for obstruction and conspiracy. Pierce's documented communications prove systematic intent to commit securities fraud, federal prosecutor Michael Torres stated. The evidence eliminates plea bargaining leverage and supports maximum criminal penalties. The criminal grand jury investigation was proceeding based on evidence of systematic securities fraud, board deception, and conspiracy to defraud multiple executives of earned compensation. Pierce faces federal charges including securities fraud, conspiracy, mail fraud, and fiduciary duty violations, Prosecutor Torres explained. The systematic nature of his compensation theft supports enhanced sentencing under federal guidelines. Meanwhile, the other terminated executives who had been victims of Pierce's systematic stock option theft were joining comprehensive civil litigation that would ensure complete compensation recovery. 6 additional executives have provided evidence of systematic termination timing designed to steal their earned stock options, civil attorney Jennifer Martinez reported. The combined fraud exceeds $3.2 million in stolen compensation. The class action structure was providing enhanced recovery capabilities while strengthening the evidence base for both civil and criminal enforcement actions. Combined victim testimony eliminates any possibility that Pierce's termination timing was coincidental, Martinez noted. The systematic pattern proves deliberate securities fraud affecting multiple executives. The board investigation was revealing that Pierce had systematically deceived directors about his termination rationale while manipulating compensation committee processes to avoid stock option obligations. Board members were unaware that Pierce's restructuring recommendations were designed to steal executive compensation, Board Investigation Counsel Sarah Wilson reported. His systematic board deception constitutes additional fraud violations. The Compensation Committee Chairman, retired CEO Thomas Reynolds, had requested independent investigation of Pierce's systematic manipulation of termination timing and option vesting procedures. Pierce violated Compensation Committee authority by implementing termination timing that contradicted approved executive compensation agreements, Reynolds stated. The board's cooperation with federal investigators was providing additional evidence of Pierce's systematic deception while ensuring comprehensive corporate governance reforms that would prevent similar fraud. Datatech's board is implementing enhanced oversight procedures to prevent executive compensation manipulation, Wilson noted. But the most significant development was Pierce's recognition that his systematic fraud had been so comprehensively documented that cooperation with federal investigators represented his only option for minimizing criminal exposure. Pierce's legal team has indicated willingness to discuss cooperation agreements, Prosecutor Torres reported. His systematic fraud creates maximum criminal exposure that justifies enhanced cooperation requirements. The cooperation discussions revealed the full scope of Pierce's systematic planning and the additional victims who had been affected by his compensation theft schemes. Pierce's cooperation has identified systematic stock option manipulation affecting executives at his previous company, Torres noted. His fraud pattern extends beyond Datatech to additional securities violations. The federal investigation was expanding to include Pierce's previous executive positions, where he had apparently used similar methods to steal earned compensation from senior staff. Pierce's systematic fraud represents a career-long pattern of securities violations and executive compensation theft, SEC investigator Walsh observed. The comprehensive enforcement actions were achieving complete victim compensation, while ensuring maximum accountability for Pierce's systematic securities fraud and corporate governance violations. Pierce's cooperation will provide complete stock option recovery for all victims, plus enhanced penalties for systematic fraud, Torres explained. The coordinated federal response was transforming Pierce's sophisticated stock option theft into comprehensive legal accountability while establishing precedents for protecting executive compensation from systematic corporate fraud. Have you ever witnessed federal enforcement capabilities applied to systematic corporate fraud that affected multiple victims across extended time periods? Sometimes comprehensive documentation enables regulatory agencies to build cases that address both immediate victim relief and industry-wide fraud prevention. The comprehensive resolution of Pierce's securities fraud case occurred within 6 months of my initial SEC complaint, delivering complete stock option recovery for all victimized executives plus enhanced penalties that reflected the systematic nature of his compensation theft and board deception. The coordinated civil enforcement and criminal prosecution created accountability that exceeded initial expectations while establishing industry precedents for protecting executive compensation from strategic manipulation. Pierce's guilty plea on all federal charges included 14 counts of securities fraud, conspiracy to defraud executives, mail fraud, and fiduciary duty violations that resulted in a 12-year federal prison sentence plus complete restitution of stolen stock option compensation. Mr. Pierce's systematic theft of executive compensation represents a serious violation of securities laws and corporate governance standards, Federal Judge Patricia Morrison stated during sentencing. His deliberate manipulation of termination timing to steal earned stock options warrants maximum punishment under federal guidelines. The criminal conviction required Pierce to forfeit all personal assets plus pay enhanced penalties that brought total victim compensation to $4.1 million, significantly exceeding the original stolen stock option values. Pierce's enhanced penalties reflect the systematic nature of his fraud and the need to deter similar corporate compensation theft, Prosecutor Torres explained. The comprehensive restitution ensures complete victim recovery plus damages for professional disruption. But beyond financial recovery, Pierce's prosecution created industry recognition of systematic documentation and compliance systems as essential protection against executive compensation fraud. Manning's comprehensive documentation provided the evidentiary foundation for the most successful securities fraud prosecution in our district's history, SEC Director Stevens noted. His systematic approach to corporate governance compliance should be adopted by technology companies nationwide. The professional opportunities that resulted from my role in exposing Pierce's systematic fraud exceeded anything my original Datatech position could have provided. Manning Technology Solutions The independent consulting firm I established using stock option recovery funds was attracting clients who needed enterprise infrastructure development from consultants with proven integrity and comprehensive governance expertise. Gregory's exposure of systematic corporate fraud demonstrates exactly the kind of ethical leadership we need for critical infrastructure projects, noted client testimonial from Morrison Industries CTO David Rodriguez. The technology consulting practice was generating annual revenue of $340,000 while providing professional satisfaction that exceeded anything achievable through traditional corporate employment. Independent consulting allows complete control over project ethics and client relationships, I reflected during professional development presentations. The former DataTech clients who followed me to Manning Technology Solutions represented validation that my technical expertise and ethical standards created more value than Pierce's cost optimization schemes. Manning's infrastructure expertise and proven integrity provide competitive advantages that justify premium pricing and long-term partnerships, explained client retention metrics showing 78% of major DataTech relationships transitioning to my independent practice. The speaking opportunities at corporate governance conferences and securities law seminars were generating additional revenue while establishing my reputation as an expert in executive compensation protection and systematic compliance documentation. Manning's experience demonstrates how comprehensive governance systems can expose and prevent systematic corporate fraud, observed conference organizer Jennifer Adams. Pierce's complete professional destruction served as industry-wide warning about the consequences of systematic executive compensation theft and securities fraud. The Pierce prosecution sends clear messages throughout the technology industry about federal enforcement capabilities for securities violations, legal analyst Robert Wilson noted. But the most meaningful outcome was validation of systematic documentation and ethical business practices as reliable protection against corporate fraud and executive manipulation. Pierce's prosecution proves that comprehensive compliance systems and ethical leadership create sustainable competitive advantages, I observed during governance workshops. The DataTech board had implemented enhanced oversight procedures based on recommendations from the federal investigation, creating industry standards for preventing executive compensation manipulation. DataTech's governance reforms have become model practices for technology companies seeking to prevent systematic compensation fraud, board governance specialist Sarah Martinez noted. The technical infrastructure I had built at DataTech continued generating value for clients and stockholders, validating my systematic approach to enterprise architecture and strategic technology planning. Manning's infrastructure designs enabled DataTech to maintain operational stability despite executive fraud and leadership disruption, industry analyst Patricia Newman observed. The comprehensive legal victory had demonstrated that systematic documentation and ethical leadership provided more reliable career security than corporate employment relationships based on convenience rather than shared governance standards. Professional competence and systematic compliance create career opportunities that transcend individual employment arrangements, I noted during professional development seminars. The stock option recovery and independent consulting success had generated financial security that exceeded anything achievable through traditional corporate advancement while providing meaningful work focused on ethical technology leadership. Manning's transformation from fraud victim to industry governance expert demonstrates how systematic integrity creates lasting competitive advantages, Technology Leadership Review noted. Pierce's systematic compensation theft had inadvertently created opportunities for professional growth, industry recognition, and business success that wouldn't have been possible within traditional corporate structures. Sometimes the most sophisticated corporate fraud becomes the catalyst for professional independence and enhanced success, I reflected during strategic planning workshops. The documentation methods that had exposed Pierce's securities fraud were being adopted by technology companies while generating ongoing consulting revenue and industry leadership recognition. Manning's compliance documentation protocols provide comprehensive protection against executive compensation fraud, while supporting legitimate business operations, noted licensing agreement with Regional Technology Consortium. Pierce's attempt to steal my earned stock options had ultimately created opportunities for enhanced financial security, professional recognition, and meaningful work that exceeded anything Datatech employment could have provided. Have you ever discovered that systematic documentation and ethical business practices could transform attempted corporate fraud into opportunities for enhanced career success and industry leadership? Sometimes comprehensive governance systems become the foundation for professional independence that exceeds traditional employment benefits. Standing in my expanded office 18 months after Pierce's conviction and imprisonment, I reflected on how his systematic stock option theft had inadvertently transformed my career from corporate technology management to industry leadership in governance, compliance, and ethical business practices. Manning Technology Solutions had grown to manage $3 million in annual consulting revenue while serving Fortune 500 companies who valued proven integrity and comprehensive compliance expertise above traditional technology consulting credentials. The 6,500 square foot facility accommodated 12 senior consultants who specialized in enterprise infrastructure development, corporate governance compliance, and executive compensation protection services that had become essential offerings for technology companies facing regulatory scrutiny and investor oversight. Working with an organization that prioritizes systematic documentation and ethical business practices provides security and credibility that attracts the highest quality client relationships, noted senior infrastructure consultant Michael Torres. Gregory's governance expertise creates competitive advantages that justify premium consulting rates. The technology consulting practice I had established was generating substantially higher income than my original Datatech salary, while providing professional satisfaction and meaningful work that focused on preventing corporate fraud and protecting executive compensation rights. Manning Technology Solutions' systematic approach to governance compliance and infrastructure development provides comprehensive protection against corporate fraud while delivering superior technical outcomes, client testimonial from Phoenix Industries CEO Jennifer Walsh noted. The stock option recovery that had resulted from Pierce's prosecution, combined with consulting revenue growth, had created financial security that exceeded anything achievable through traditional corporate employment while providing independence and professional recognition. Gregory's transformation from fraud victim to industry governance leader demonstrates how systematic integrity and comprehensive documentation create lasting competitive advantages, Technology Governance Quarterly observed. But the most significant achievement was industry recognition that established me as the definitive expert in executive compensation protection and systematic compliance documentation for technology companies. Manning's experience provides unique insights into preventing and detecting corporate fraud that threatens executive compensation and stockholder value, Securities Law Review noted. The Securities Commission had requested my participation in developing enhanced governance standards and compliance oversight protocols that would prevent systematic executive compensation theft by corporate management. Manning's documentation methods and fraud detection expertise provide essential guidance for strengthening corporate governance standards, SEC Governance Committee Chair Patricia Stevens explained. Annual speaking engagements at securities law conferences, corporate governance seminars, and technology leadership events were generating supplemental income of $125,000 while reinforcing my expertise in systematic compliance and ethical business practices. Manning's systematic approach to governance, documentation, and fraud prevention has become the industry standard for technology companies seeking investor confidence, National Technology Association President David Kim observed. Pierce's 12-year federal prison sentence had concluded with complete forfeiture of assets, permanent disbarment from corporate management, and ongoing restitution obligations that would continue for decades. Pierce's systematic securities fraud resulted in the most comprehensive corporate governance prosecution in federal court history, Federal Prosecutor Torres noted. His case demonstrates that executive compensation theft carries severe criminal consequences that cannot be avoided through sophisticated planning. But Pierce's prosecution had also created enhanced protection for technology industry executive compensation by establishing legal precedents that strengthened securities enforcement and corporate governance oversight. The Pierce prosecution clarified federal enforcement capabilities for systematic compensation fraud and established deterrent effects throughout the technology industry, legal analyst Sarah Martinez observed. The corporate governance methodologies I had developed and refined through Pierce's fraud exposure were generating licensing revenue from technology companies who needed proven compliance frameworks while ensuring proper implementation and ethical oversight. Manning's governance protocols provide comprehensive protection against executive compensation fraud while supporting legitimate business operations and investor confidence. Noted licensing agreement with Southwest Technology Alliance. The professional reputation I had built through ethical crisis management was attracting strategic consulting opportunities with major technology companies who valued demonstrated integrity and systematic governance expertise. Manning Technology Solutions' proven governance capabilities and ethical standards make them ideal partners for complex infrastructure projects and compliance initiatives. Explained consulting agreement with Denver-based technology consortium. Looking back on Pierce's systematic betrayal and attempted theft of my earned stock options, I realized that his sophisticated securities fraud had inadvertently created opportunities for professional growth, industry leadership, and business success that exceeded anything traditional corporate employment could have provided. Sometimes the most comprehensive corporate fraud becomes the catalyst for professional development and industry recognition that transforms entire career trajectories, I observed during technology leadership conferences. The systematic documentation that had exposed Pierce's securities violations was serving as the foundation for expanded consulting services that helped other technology professionals protect earned compensation while maintaining ethical business practices. Pierce's fraud attempt validated the commercial value of systematic governance compliance while creating legal precedents that enhanced industry-wide executive protection, I noted during professional development workshops. The comprehensive legal victory had demonstrated that systematic documentation and ethical business practices provided more reliable career security than corporate employment relationships based on convenience rather than shared governance standards. Professional competence in systematic compliance and ethical leadership creates sustainable competitive advantages that transcend individual employment arrangements or corporate management changes, I explained during governance presentations. Pierce's attempt to steal my stock options through systematic securities fraud had ultimately strengthened my professional position while creating consulting opportunities and industry recognition that established Manning Technology Solutions as the regional leader in ethical technology consulting and governance compliance. The people who attempt to destroy others' earned compensation through systematic corporate fraud sometimes end up creating opportunities for their victims to achieve greater success through validated expertise and comprehensive ethical standards, I reflected during industry leadership seminars. The experience had proven that professional competence in systematic documentation and ethical business practices could transform attempted securities fraud into enhanced career success and industry authority that exceeded original corporate compensation packages. Pierce's systematic stock option theft had inadvertently provided the foundation for building industry leadership, professional recognition, and business expansion that represented the most successful and meaningful period in my 22-year technology career. Professional relationships built on systematic integrity and ethical standards prove more durable and valuable than corporate employment based on convenient arrangements or management preferences that can be manipulated for personal advantage. The consulting practice that had emerged from Pierce's attempted theft was generating higher income, enhanced industry recognition, and more meaningful client relationships than anything traditional corporate employment could have achieved. Have you discovered that systematic documentation and ethical business practices can transform attempted corporate fraud into opportunities for professional growth and industry leadership. Sometimes the most sophisticated securities violations become the foundation for building enhanced competitive advantages through validated integrity and comprehensive governance expertise. If this story of systematic documentation and securities enforcement resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button to Revenge Tales with Luke. Share your experiences with corporate fraud and executive compensation protection in the comments below. Your story might help someone else who's facing similar challenges with systematic securities violations and corporate governance manipulation. See you in our next story.